Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and today on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast, we continue our interview with Casey and Marie Norris from the Potato Candy Podcast Network to talk about tabletop role-playing games, plus scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this. 2022 is flying by so fast, and I just reviewed my goals for the year. It's not too late to set some effective goals for 2022 for yourself. And the Goal Process 101 ebook helps you do just that. With a straightforward process and practical exercises, you'll be guided to set the right goals for you and set out a plan to achieve them. Get your copy of the Goal Process 101 ebook by going to goalprocess101.com. Use CNU2022 at checkout to save 10%. Now, back to the show. This week, we have part 2 of our interview with Casey and Marie Norris from Potato Candy. We dig more deeply into creating scenarios for tabletop role-playing games, talk about what it's like playing together as a married couple, and how they got into role-playing games in the first place. For our scripture reading today, I was thinking about this past Sunday because it was Pentecost for those who follow the church calendar. And that's a time where we remember the events of Acts 2. So let's read some of it. Let's start with Acts 2, 1 through 8. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears in our own native tongue?" And Acts 2, 41 through 43. Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. I pray that we as believers have the opportunity to share the gospel with others on a regular basis and see people coming to faith and obedience to Jesus. If you are interested in a unique and natural way to share the gospel with others, check out our friends at contagiousdisciplemaking.com. I know they would love to hear from you. And now, let's get into some nerdy news. This is going to be a big month for Marvel and Disney+. Marvel's new Disney Plus show, Ms. Marvel, releases this week on June 8th. And Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness will hit the streaming service on June 22nd. And in other Marvel news, The Hollywood Reporter has announced that Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick will be returning as writers for the upcoming Deadpool 3. And along with director Sean Levy, they are promising the movie will still feel like Deadpool, even though it's now under the Disney Marvel umbrella. With Marvel's more irreverent animation outings like MODOK and Hitmonkey, both available on Hulu, it seems that Marvel Disney is more willing to explore these adult themes than they have been in the past. So we'll have to wait and see what Deadpool 3 really has in store for us. For those who enjoy dystopian science fiction, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes The upcoming film, based on Susan Collins' book from 2 years ago, has a confirmed release date now, November 17th, 2023. The prequel is set 64 years before, and we find an 18-year-old Coriolanus Snow as the mentor for Lucy Gray Baird, the tribute from District 12 for the 10th annual Hunger Games. If you enjoyed the original series, this should be a good follow-up that will build on the existing backstory of the games. Well, that's all the nerdy news for now. Let's continue with our interview with Casey and Marie Norris from the Potato Candy Podcast Network. And if you missed part 1, go back and check it out last week. So when you guys are setting up scenarios, and I know, one of your shows, that's what you do. When you're setting up a scenario and you want to create a world, where do you get your where do you kind of get the ideas that you want to put into this world? I know some GMs actually get thoughts from the players, to help flesh out the world. Some GMs would never think to do that. But for your personal games, not necessarily like the show where it's like, give me a prompt and we're going to come up with a scenario. But where do you get, when do you start sitting down? It's like, I'm going to set up a new world, a new plan, a new story. Where do you get your inspiration personally?
I usually start where the question always is for me, what's interesting? Because if I'm not invested in the story to start with, the player's never going to be. We were out at dinner Sunday night with some friends, and I made a mention it'd be great to do D&D with everyone playing the Ninja Turtles. And immediately 2 people at the table like, yes, let's do it. I'm like, I just thought it'd be fun new Ninja Turtles in a D&D system. Because to me, that's interesting, which means the players are also going to be interested in it. And so if the players don't want to do something, I tend not to push it. Although I will sneak something in there that I like at least. But if I know I'm interested in it and I know the players are down for it, that's usually where I start from. Okay, this is a good framework. I'm going to build the details that I need, and then I'm going to let them know where they fit into the world for their characters.
Yeah, for me, if you listen to Blank Scenario, you will hear 9 times out of 10, whenever it comes to my take on the prompt, it is way more complicated than a one-shot and typically has the difficulty of being slightly convoluted. It's the nature of my brain that I tend to overcomplicate things rather than simplify. So the first step, similar to what Marie said, is finding an interest. And usually either it's like an environment that I want to be able to send the players to that could be fun, or if there's more recently, it's been a lot of accents because I collect accents as a person. If there's a specific accent on a character or an actor that I like a lot, and so I'll start practicing it. I'm like, okay, where can I throw that character in? What would that be interesting to run with? And I'll go from there. But a lot of times, it just comes down to creating what I want my overarching theme to be, or overarching idea to be. I think it was last summer. No. Last spring, I took a writing course in horror because I wanted to be able to like grow what ability that I had, and so I still use a lot of steps from that. Of start with what's the thing you want them to be afraid of, then move from that into what are if we're writing a book, it's like, what are the characters that they're going to have? Well, I know the characters already. So what's the thing I want to delve into with those characters? What's the thing they're going to find out about themselves? Because I try to make sure each character gets a spotlight. That's the hardest part of any kind of developing story, because if you're not willing to give your characters that spotlight moment, then it just kind of loses some of its luster. Then digging into the monster, how's the monster or the problem going to develop itself, where the players are having to deal with it. And so I know you're not talking about specific to the show, but to be honest, like, the show is about the only times we play anymore. Like, that's the amount of free time that we have. So
Yeah.
only being able to speak to that, the most recent one that'll be releasing takes place in Russia, and is there because Isaac's character in Monster of the Week is that Russian statue. And I wanted to be able to spend some time doing some Russian accents. And then from there, it developed out into, well, it would be really cool if there's this kind of town, and this town has some really interesting secrets to it. And it just developed out from there into this big old war of factions, and kind of a few dollars more meets maybe The Witch might be a good comparison to make to it. But that's where my brain ends up going, because it's like, let me connect it to this and to this over here. And this bit. And so, like I said, convoluted and complicated, and have to figure out ways to boil that down.
Nice. Well, I probably should have started with this question, but we're going to ask it now anyway.
Okay.
How did you both get started with role-playing games? I mentioned earlier that Heroes was the old hero system was something that I played, and GURPS was kind of where I really cut my teeth on getting deeply involved. But where did you guys start playing role-playing games? How did that happen? What did that look like for you guys?
My dad attempted to get me into role-playing games in high school, and I thought it was too nerdy. Because my dad
And
grew
now
up playing.
you do a podcast about them.
I know. Now I'm like, well, I should take in his advice at that point. But I got into board games towards the end of college, and that led into RPGs. And I think I did one session of D&D where I played as a halfling, or not halfling. I played as a Goliath barbarian.
Yep.
And Casey was at the time was playing a halfling rogue that I carried on my back and threw at people. Was it druid? Okay.
Yeah, it was a druid because I
You're a
had a
halfling.
shillelagh.
Yeah, I was able to
Nice.
throw you. That's all I remember. And from that point on, I was hooked. And that was 2014 is when I started. And from there, it was just a downward spiral of what RPGs can I get.
Nice.
Yeah, for me, I don't have that same that same kind of story arc. I was homeschooled all 12 years. Me and all three of my all two of my older brothers, and being homeschooled, it was like, no friends, just family and together. And I remember one time when I was like 8, walking through a Best Buy and seeing a board game that looked really cool, and I wanted to get it. And my mom walked by and goes, "Oh, you don't want that. Those take too long to play." Well, it was some kind of strategy game that had the hex squares and the whole setup for it that, I'm a fancy nerd now. I know what these are. But I got my start doing Pathfinder back in college. Okay. And I think the very first time that I role played was actually online. It was over a summer campaign, and I bothered our DM to no end because I had just done the Big Friendly Giant, and I wanted to try to recreate the Big Friendly Giant as a character. And so we had like a half giant, half dwarf class that he created. And I was like, can I boulder roll and like roll people over? But man, that took forever to do. And then from Pathfinder, got into D&D, and that's where I stayed for a good long while until some of the shine wore off, and then moved into anything and everything I could find RPG, from Fiasco to Little Fears, Call of Cthulhu, Everyone is John, which I still love running.
Yep. We do an annual Dread game with our family where Dread is played with a Jenga tower. And so whenever you do something, instead of making a dice roll, you pull a block from the tower. So it's been great for family because everyone's gotten really into it. And the last game we ran, I did a Wild West campaign. And it got to the point where there's basically a shootout happening where everyone was trying to figure out who the marshal was and who was actually an outlaw. And everyone just shot each other. And of course, we're doing as family. And like, well, this is great. We have trust issues, apparently. But I think 3 people died by the end of it. It was very interesting.
Honestly, the Jenga tower is one of my favorite mechanics that I have ever heard of in a role playing game. I think it's fascinating because it's there is some actual skill involved here and some luck.
Oh yes,
yeah.
So it's not just the roll of the dice. How nervous are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also great because we have technically 3 Jenga towers at this point.
Mhm.
We have a standard, we have a miniature one that came with the dice you could roll to see what color you pull. And my personal favorite is the chalkboard tower that's painted black with chalkboard paint, so you can mark on it. And the paint sticks more than a standard tower does. So
Oh,
it's got
no.
more friction when
No.
you're trying to pull a piece. It's fun.
Oh, that sounds horrific.
Mhm.
Yeah. I love using Dread up at school for my kids because I'll run for my smallest advanced class that I do. I'll run a Dread game for them every October, just as a kind of this is an introduction to storytelling and improv and all these different things. And yeah, as freaked out as they get more freaked out if somebody is goofing around the table that the Jenga tower's on.
So as a married couple who is playing, how does that dynamic work for you guys when you're playing a role-playing game? I had to ask this question.
Yeah. So I'll say my comment before Casey does, just because I don't know what he's about to say. There was a comment that our friend Isaac said when we were doing a game. It was just me, Casey, and Isaac. And Casey was playing a character that, because I played a female character, he decided he had to flirt with every female character NPC that would show up. And Isaac made a comment, it's like watching 50 First Dates. And just seeing this happen over and over again.
Yep.
But for the most part, that's pretty minimal for us. We tend to be more focused on what the character is, so our relationship kind of just, it's on the sidelines, and we're just like, here's what my character does, here's how they interact with the world. So we manage to balance that pretty well, I would say, at least. Yeah.
I'd agree. Yeah, whenever we first got married, one of the first, I wouldn't even say arguments, but one of the first real solid discussions that we had was sitting around a board gaming table, and both of us are people pleasers, and she made the comment that she was sorry for something she did, and I just said back, I'm like, no, you're not. Because if you were sorry about it, you wouldn't have done it. So from that point on, we made the agreement that whenever it came to playing games, we weren't going to say, I'm sorry. We'll hug and say, I love you, and make up at the end of it. But our goal is to be competitive. And a lot of times that carries over into the games that we run for each other of not necessarily I want to be antagonistic, but if you're going to be here, you want to have fun. And the way that you have fun is having those challenges come up.
Cool. Now, you mentioned something interesting there, being competitive. And earlier you mentioned something about, how the GM interacts with the players. So in a horror situation, in a horror story, I know there's kind of this, some people have this view as a player that the GM is always out to get us. And then there are certain GMs that are definitely always out to get the players.
Yeah.
And then there are other GMs that are constantly rooting for the players. But, the dice are what they are, and I'm going to go with what the dice say, but I'm rooting for you. In a horror campaign, is that any different?
I wouldn't say so. For me, at the risk of taking away some of the fun from Marie, I tend to lean more into that latter category of I want the characters to at least have a chance. And I think there's a couple times in probably both of the campaigns that are out right now where you can hear it in all of our voices the second that the dice hits the table and it's not the number that we wanted and not the number that we needed, that all of us are like, oh no, this character's about to die. And so I have to think in my head at that point, what's the price that they're going to pay? Because I've told them as well, the interest with the game disappears whenever death is taken off the table. Like, especially with horror, but that's when death is no longer there. What's the point, right? You can do anything and everything you want with no consequences. There always has to be a consequence of some kind. So then it becomes the point of how can I make this cost them something? And that to me is where a lot of the fun of it lies, because I think death is always going to be on the table for our characters. And, that's scary to say, especially for a system that deals specifically with kids. Like, that's a sensitive topic, but finding that balance between ensuring that that danger is there, or that feeling of danger is there, and having to actually carry out whatever the case is going to be. It's a hard line to walk. It really is. It's the nature of the question.
Yeah, I think it helps too. I know as a player, I never feel like Casey's out to get us. As much as we roll dice and roll 50, we see his face just turn sour as he realizes we've completely ruined any chance of us having problems going forward. There's always the part that we know he's not putting us in these situations to kill us.
Mm-hmm.
He's putting us in a situation because this is where story's going. These are probably the choices we made, which is like 90% of what my character does most of the time. I tell people my character is the reason the story progresses because I cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
So my character is usually in danger because I put her there. And now I have to deal with the consequences, and the dice don't work for me. There's not much. I'm about 99% sure my character in Monster of the Week is going to die horrifically at some point. I'm just kind of mentally like hoping I can have a sacrifice moment of, no, go, I'll save you. And then I can come back as someone else. We'll see if that happens, but
I don't know if Doc would be the type to be willing to sacrifice herself, though. That's the thing.
I've turned into Luke Skywalker, essentially. It's fine.
I mean, well, just because you've lost body parts like he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I will say
goodness.
This is kind of in service to the question you asked earlier about developing stories, but it occurs to me, I forgot to mention, one of the things that I love to do, and this really just helps to tighter knit the players together if you do it right as a GM, is presenting your players with what you as the GM see as a no-win situation. Let me give you a situation where you can't win no matter what it is that you try, because I can't come up with anything, and then see what they come up with. And it has yet to fail me that they will find a way around it, something I didn't think of, something I didn't see, that will get them around that corner. Now, sometimes that still comes with consequences, but ultimately it creates a story that is much more cohesive in the long run because they're the ones that move themselves into that position. But like what Marie said, when the player's the one making the decisions that gets them in trouble, then that's on the players. And I had nothing to do with that.
Yep.
So let's go. Let me ask you one more question about the horror aspect.
Okay.
Especially with this being a Christian Nerds Unite podcast. We definitely, at the Christian Nerds Unite podcast group, we definitely have a group of nerds that are really into horror. But there is a group of Christian nerds that have a lot of pushback against the horror genre in general. How do you address that? If you were receiving pushback from someone, how would you address that idea?
Oh, that's a heavy question. Being honest, I have not received any kind of pushback on it yet, but it would depend upon the thing that they have problems over. Because I think for me, like a lot of things in the world, we are essentially dealing in fantasy whenever it comes to the role playing specifically, but to horror, we're essentially dealing in a fantasy realm. So anything can be the case in that world. For me, I think the draw of doing something horror, and for me at least what makes it okay, is horror feels so much more real to life. Not that life is a horror story, but horror leans heavily into choices have consequences. And those consequences may be heavy and those consequences may be bad. But just like in real life, whenever characters make choices, whenever we make choices, there are consequences that come with them. And sometimes they're consequences we see coming, and sometimes they're not. One of the beauties of horror specifically is that there are so many subgenres to it that you can play around with, from psychological to, just pure monster mash to, if you want to get grotesque with it, you can get grotesque with it. There are so many different categories underneath it. Just to give a broad ban on, well, it's horror, it's bad, I think undercuts the genre, because there's Christian fantasy out there. And for some people, they would say the same thing, that undercuts, biblical principle or undercuts, and at a certain point, it goes back to what I said before about quote unquote Christian media. If you can get past the idea that content specifically is Christian, because what we do with it is what makes it a Christian approach or not. If you can get past that, then ultimately it shouldn't matter. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it ultimately shouldn't matter. But if it's not your thing, I'm not going to force horror on anyone. There's enough trauma to go around for people without them playing around with something that already is hurting them.
Any thoughts, Marie?
Yeah. One thing for me that I was thinking about before the interview of we never intentionally made a podcast that was Christian, although we knew very, very early on that our views are going to influence the content we talk about, the shows that we put out. In a series that we no longer have, we had a show called The Curators, where Casey and I reviewed different movies, podcasts, books, whatever it was we had read, and just talked about them. And our opener was always, we are a 30-something-year-old married couple, Christian with no kids, and that's our view. So people knew right up front, here's what we think and why. And I think for the shows, while we never say explicitly we are a Christian show, here's content we don't do, there are definitely things that we don't cross the line on, but there are some things that we're okay with. For Monster of the Week, it's been hinted at that I essentially have a demon butler, that we have demons in this world. However, for what we set up, it's much less about a religious aspect and more of a interdimensional being. That we basically grounded it in sci-fi, even though we're calling them demons, it's a lot more of a sci-fi approach than a religious approach. And that's where we're comfortable with. Now, not everyone is comfortable with that, and I respect that. I know people that cannot watch any movies with a ghost or possession in it because that's too close to home for them. I have trouble with home invasion films for that reason. It's too close to home. I can't do them. I can watch a demon destroying stuff all day long and be fine, though. It's just what you're comfortable with and what you're going to be able to go, okay, this is fantasy. This isn't real. I'm not crossing any lines that I'm not okay with, so I can consume this and be fine.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would say, like if we want to take this in a biblical approach, it goes back to what's talked about in Corinthians about not searing your conscience at this point. If it's not something you're comfortable with, then you don't have to be around it. And no shame for those who don't want to be, because by all means, don't make things worse for yourself in the long run.
Absolutely. Good word. Appreciate your thoughts there. So let's kind of start wrapping up a little bit. Let me ask you this. Is there a system that you've always wanted to play, but you haven't had a chance to? Now, I know Marie kind of alluded to Cthulhu is kind of the thing that she's wanted to do, but she feels like she really hasn't yet.
I've managed it a couple of times with online games. It's not quite the same as sitting around the table with friends and getting to play through the system.
But is there a system that you've read about, or you thought about, or you learned about that you said, this is something I really, really want to try, I just haven't had a chance yet?
I've got two. Casey, I'll let you go first, though.
Okay. Well,
Unless you're still thinking.
Considering what he said before, this is gonna bring down the shame. The closest I have ever gotten to playing GURPS is GURPS Ultralight, and I enjoyed GURPS Ultralight, but it is such a detailed, crunchy system that it scares me. And I would love to play it just because I got into GURPS because of the Film Reroll podcast. Listening to them do rerolls using GURPS is amazing. And I would love to be able to do that with GURPS, but man, the planning that would go into it, I need more than a summer off to be able to do it. It just, one day. And I have so many books for it. I have so many books for GURPS. And
he uses them to plan every other system except GURPS.
Yep.
Hey, I will say the GURPS books are super well thought out. There's tons and tons of research that go into the GURPS books. They are definitely worth having as resource books on your shelf, even if you never play the GURPS system. I'm right there with you.
But the shame is real because it's right there. One
Nice.
day.
For me, there are two systems I would love to play in that I don't think I'll get the chance just because they're not systems I think I'd be comfortable with. I'd love to do Apocalypse World, the original system. There's a mechanic in that system, of course, that is based around the idea of your characters having sex, which immediately I'm like, how do I cut that out of the game?
Yeah.
But it's so interwoven. It's like, I can't cut it out of the game because they interwove it into the game. So doing a lot of the games that are based around Apocalypse World kind of fills that gap a little bit. There's a part of it that feels like there's still a way to adapt it to where it would be appropriate, but it's one of those I just don't think I could ever do without just rooting the system and just might as well do something else. The other one that kind of has the same issue is Vampire Masquerade. And it's mostly because the vampire aspect is just, it's interesting. How do you play a character that's not human, but is kind of human still? And that's an interesting balance. But a lot of people who play that system tends to lean more in the sexual aspect of the vampire is very suave and very sexy. And it's like, that's not something I want to dig into. So it's finding games for that don't cross those lines for me. But it's a fascinating system. I love the concept of fighting kind of inner demons and hunger and having to balance humanity with a monster. It's a great system, but most of the content they make for it isn't something I'd feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And that's the balance for me there.
And what is kind of the next thing that you guys have on your plate? What's coming up that you're looking forward to?
Well, I know for Blank Scenario, we're slowly starting to expand out our pool of people on the show. So I'm starting to have guests on. We've done a couple of interviews with people that have RPGs that either have been out or they're releasing. And so we got to talk a little bit about their content creation for their process. I'm trying to figure out other segments for Blank Scenario that I can do. And it's the balance between what's interesting and what's not been overdone. There's a lot of shows that do D&D topics and help and monsters. And so it's finding something that's interesting to me that will still have enough target appeal. So that's currently what I'm looking at from my show.
And when summer hits, hopefully, Dreadful Tales will be able to expand what it's doing. That's one of the frustrating limitations of being a teacher. It's like, well, I get 2 months. But for us, at the risk of sounding more nerdy, I don't know if anybody out there has heard of the Bailey School Children books. I was a huge fan of them whenever I was growing up. It probably is what kickstarted my love of horror. But they're a series of books that deal with kids that are in like an elementary school, and they think that all of the adults in their town are different monsters. And so like each book deals with a different monster or creature that shows up. Like Santa Claus shows up in one of them, but I think the very first one is vampires don't wear polka dots, and they get a new teacher that may or may not be a vampire. Anyways, I say all that to say this, because I love Little Fears so much, I took that idea and I thought, well, if we're going to do guest spots, or if we're going to have guests come on, let's create, based on those books, a session for each book and have a guest come through and, deal with the Bailey School kids or deal with whatever these things are, and like non-copyright breaking somehow figure out a way to make these stories a little bit updated and cool to do with horror. So if I can start getting guests actually on and have the time to actually record with them, that's what's going to be coming down the pike eventually.
That sounds awesome. Well, where can people follow you?
On Facebook, Instagram. We need to get better at Twitter.
I've been trying to do better at Twitter. I'm not a Twitter fan. It's just not my style. There's way too much information. But Instagram, Facebook at Potato Candy Network, Twitter at Potato Candy Net, because there's a character count apparently.
Yeah.
We've also got our website, potatocandy.com, as well as email that you can reach us at.
I always forget about the website.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Obviously, you're not the one in charge of that
website. Yeah, I'm not. Dumb brain, no detail.
Well, I will definitely gather all those links and I will put them down in the show notes below. Marie, Casey, it has been wonderful getting to know you guys. I'm super excited about what you guys are doing. Definitely want to have you on the show again sometime. to talk
Absolutely.
about RPGs and what other things you're doing over at Potato Candy.
Yep.
Thank you so much for being on the show
Marvel,
today.
We'll be back.
Yeah.
Awesome. It was great getting to know Marie and Casey. And if you missed part 1, definitely go check it out in our previous episodes. And check out the links down below in the show notes so that you can connect if you want to hear more from Marie and Casey. I also hope you will check out our bonus episodes that we're releasing on Fridays periodically over the summer. We just dropped one this past Friday. I am joined by the hosts of The Reverend and the Reprobate, Lucas Pinkard and Dan Gibson, the host of Fangirling Over Jesus, Ashley Cox, the host of Speaking Nerdy podcast, Mike Schilling, and the great BB Nate from the Tatooine Sons podcast, as we do an actual play of the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game playtest. Check out the bonus episodes and each of their podcasts for lots of fun and some inspiration. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, click whatever the buttons are there down there and give us a review, give us comments. We love to hear from you. And if you click all those buttons, you'll keep up with us. And every time we put out new content, you'll get notified. And you can find all of our social links to our YouTube channel and our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. I do want to take a moment to encourage you to join us as a supporter on Patreon. We've changed all of our Patreon levels, and every level has great benefits and makes a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers we are serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or go to ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click on the support tab in the menu. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Psalm 20. May the Lord answer you when you are in distress. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and grant you support from Zion. We'll see you next week. Blessings.